Buenos Aires, Argentina. December 2001, two brothers, same family, same neighborhood, same economic collapse happening around them. The first brother has a university degree in business administration, 4 years of education, a respectable job at a financial firm, a salary that made their mother proud. The second brother dropped out at 17. He spent 3 years learning how to fix industrial refrigeration units from a man who had calluses on his hands and grease permanently under his fingernails. Within 6 months of the crash, the first brother had no income. The firm was gone. The peso was worthless. His credential meant nothing in a country where the entire financial system had just been announced dead on arrival. The second brother was busier than he had ever been in his life. Every restaurant, every butcher shop, every cold storage facility in the city needed someone who could keep their refrigeration running. Because food spoilage was now the difference between eating and not eating. He wasn't just surviving the collapse. He was getting rich inside it. Most people think that story is about trade skills versus office skills. It isn't. That is the surface reading, the shallow version, the one that misses the actual mechanism. The real story is about something deeper. It is about which skills generate more value the worse the economy gets. Not less, more. And that is a category of skill that almost nobody is deliberately building right now. Because in good times, these skills look ordinary, unremarkable, even boring. But the forensic record of every economic collapse in modern history tells the same story with the same conclusion. There are skills that compound in value as systems break down, and the people who hold them don't just survive a collapse. They emerge from it wealthier than when it started. Here are 5 of them, and the history that proves why. Let's start with the one that has the oldest forensic record, the one that appears in every economic collapse from Weimar Germany to post-Soviet Russia to Venezuela. Repair, not manufacturing, not building new things, repairing existing ones. These sound similar. They are structurally opposite, and the difference between them is everything. In a growing economy, the dominant economic behavior is replacement. Your phone slows down, you upgrade. Your car reaches 100,000 miles, you trade it in. Your appliance breaks, you buy a new one. This is the engine of consumer capitalism, and it functions beautifully when credit is cheap and incomes are stable. But in a collapsing economy, replacement dies almost overnight. The credit is gone, the income is gone, the imported parts are gone. And suddenly every broken thing that would have been discarded must now be kept running. This is the moment when repair becomes not just valuable but critical infrastructure. And the person who can do it becomes not just a tradesperson, but an essential node in the survival economy. Let me show you exactly how this played out in Argentina in 2001, because the numbers are specific and they are extraordinary. Before the peso devaluation, Argentina had a robust automotive market. Middle-class families were replacing vehicles on a 3 to 4 year cycle. Standard consumer behavior in a functioning economy. After the collapse, the National Bureau of Economic Research documented something remarkable. The Argentine automotive repair sector processed approximately 30% more vehicles in 2002 than it had in 2000. During the worst economic contraction in the country's history, repair mechanics were busier than they had been during the boom. And not just busier. The real wages of skilled mechanics in the informal economy actually increased because supply contracted faster than demand. There were fewer mechanics operating. But there were suddenly vastly more broken things that desperately needed fixing. The mechanic who could take a 1994 Ford Falcon with 200,000 kilometers on it and make it run another 5 years wasn't a tradesperson anymore. He was performing an economically irreplaceable function. He was the difference between a family having transportation and not having it. The same forensic signature appeared in Weimar Germany between 1921 and 1923. As the mark fell from 75 per US dollar to 4.2 trillion per dollar, the institutional economy evaporated. Clerks, accountants, middle managers, professionals, all economically annihilated. But the skilled tradespeople who maintained the physical infrastructure of daily life operated in a parallel barter economy that the hyperinflation couldn't fully reach. A Berlin plumber in 1923 wasn't paid in marks. He was paid in coal, bread, sausage, firewood. His skill bypassed the dying monetary system entirely and plugged directly into the real economy of survival goods. And this is the mechanism that makes repair skill uniquely powerful. It doesn't just hold its value during a collapse, it inverts. Most skills are correlated with economic prosperity. When the economy grows, demand for your skill grows. When the economy contracts, demand shrinks. You ride the cycle. Repair skill counter-cycles. The worse things get, the more broken things accumulate. The more broken things accumulate, the more desperately people need someone who can fix them. You are not riding the economic cycle. You are running in the opposite direction from everyone else. In Cuba, during the special period of 1993, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba lost 80% of its oil imports overnight, this mechanism played out at a national scale. The Cuban government couldn't import new equipment. The old Soviet machinery needed to keep running. A mechanic who could fabricate replacement parts from scrap metal became more valuable to the Cuban state than a university-trained economist. Not because the economist was stupid, because the economist's skill required institutions that no longer existed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data through 2024 confirms this is not just historical. HVAC mechanics are projected to see 8% growth through 2034. Electricians at 9%. Solar installers at 48% over the decade. But here is what those projections don't capture. In a genuine economic dislocation, those demand numbers don't grow at 8%. They can triple. Because the pool of people who can do the work shrinks, while the pool of things that need fixing explodes. Repair skill is a long position on economic dysfunction. And dysfunction, as history has demonstrated, is always available. Now we get to the one that the economic forensics identify as the single highest wealth creation skill in every documented collapse. And almost nobody's talking about it. Warsaw, Poland, 1989. The communist government has just fallen. The zloty is in freefall. Inflation is running at 250% annually and accelerating. On the streets outside the central train station, a group of men are conducting transactions. They are not businessmen. They hold no licenses. They have no offices. They are operating entirely outside the formal economy. What they are doing is reading the gap between two parallel monetary systems in real time, the official zloty rate published by the government, and the real rate that the market was actually willing to exchange at. And they were getting extraordinarily rich doing it, not because they were dishonest, but because they were providing the most critical economic function that any collapsing economy possesses. They were translating value between a dying monetary system and a surviving one. This is what I call monetary translation skill, and the forensic record of it is the most consistently underreported wealth creation story in modern financial history. Here's the mechanism you need to understand. When a currency collapses, what is actually happening is that the official price signal, the system through which an economy communicates value, is being systematically destroyed. Prices expressed in the dying currency become noise, not signal. But humans still need to coordinate economic activity. They still need to buy food, pay rent, compensate labor, execute transactions. What they desperately need is someone who can translate between the dying signal and the emerging one. That person is not a speculator. That person is providing critical infrastructure. Let me take you to Lebanon between 2019 and 2023. The Lebanese pound collapsed from 1,500 to the dollar to 89,000 to the dollar. An entire banking system froze. An entire middle class was financially annihilated in the space of 18 months. But throughout that collapse, the Saraf operators, informal currency exchange brokers deeply embedded in Lebanese commercial culture, continued functioning. They were the capillaries of the economy when the arteries had hardened. They facilitated every transaction between the dying pound and the dollar economy that had replaced it. They were not wealthy before the collapse. Many of them were small neighborhood exchange operators, but their understanding of monetary translation made them indispensable during the crisis. And indispensable in a collapse means extraordinarily well compensated. History has no exceptions to this rule. The same pattern appears in Zimbabwe between 2007 and 2009. The official currency was imploding so fast that the government was printing $100 trillion notes. But the informal economy didn't stop. It reorganized around the US dollar, the South African rand, and commodity barter. The people who acted as translation nodes between these parallel systems, who could price a transaction in multiple simultaneous currencies, who understood what a bond note was worth versus a greenback, were the lubricant that kept commerce from seizing entirely. They didn't just survive the collapse, they built capital during it. Venezuela, from 2016 to the present, demonstrates the most modern version of this skill. The Bolivar collapse created an entire informal economy of foreign exchange operators. According to World Bank data on Venezuelan economic informalization, by 2021, approximately 65% of all transactions in Venezuela were being conducted in foreign currency, primarily dollars. The informal operators who enabled this shift were not speculators. They were the people who kept the economy breathing, and they were compensated accordingly. Ray Dalio, in his study of changing world orders, identifies what he calls the last stage of reserve currency decline, not as a moment of sudden rupture, but as a period of accelerating monetary fragmentation. In every historical case he examined, the Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling, the pre-war German mark, there was an intermediate period in which multiple currencies competed for dominance within the same economy. The people who could read and operate across that fragmentation captured disproportionate value. Not because they were predatory, because they were providing the most critical infrastructure that any economy in transition requires. The monetary translation skill has three components: understanding how prices are actually being set in the informal or parallel economy, reading the real exchange rate between whatever is dying and whatever is replacing it, and having the network and trust to facilitate that exchange for others. None of these require a finance degree. None of them require institutional access. What makes this skill rare is not that it is difficult. It is that almost nobody studies it before they need it. In 2026, the relevant translation isn't just between currencies, it is between traditional fiat systems and the digital alternatives, stablecoins, and commodity-backed instruments that are increasingly running parallel to official monetary systems in economies under stress. The person who understands how value moves between these systems is building one of the most durable forms of economic leverage available in this decade. History has been demonstrating this for 300 years. The lesson has never changed. Moscow suburbs, summer 1992. The Soviet Union has been dead for 8 months. Shop shelves are empty. Inflation is running at 2,600% annually. Pensions that represented a lifetime of work are vaporizing in real time. And yet something is happening in the small plots of land outside the city. Something that will keep Russia from experiencing a famine, despite a contraction that would have destroyed lesser societies. 71% of Russian households have a dacha, a small plot of land, usually between 600 and 1,500 square meters, located outside the city, and they know how to use it. By 1992, Dachas were producing 92% of Russia's potato crop, 77% of its vegetables, 87% of its berries and fruit, 59% of its meat, 49% of its milk. Households representing perhaps 3% of arable land were producing more than half of the country's food supply, on plots smaller than many suburban backyards. Russia did not experience a famine after the Soviet collapse. This is not an accident. It is not luck. It is entirely attributable to the preservation of household food production knowledge across generations of Soviet citizens, the knowledge of how to plant, harvest, preserve, and store food. Knowledge that the state had never fully extinguished despite decades of collectivized agriculture. That knowledge was the most important national food security asset in Russian history. But here is the distinction that most people miss entirely. And it is the distinction that separates the people who merely survived from the people who built wealth. It wasn't the ownership of land that protected Russian families in 1992. It was the knowledge of food production and preservation. Academic economists and urban professionals who had acquired dachas as status symbols in the 1980s, but had never actually learned to farm, were no better protected than their urban neighbors. The soil was there, the seeds were available, but the knowledge was the survival variable. And in a barter economy, the survival variable is the wealth variable. Because what you can produce that others cannot is the basis of every exchange. It is the foundation of every negotiation. It is the source of every advantage. The Argentine barter network, the Truque, which at its peak involved 6 million Argentines trading goods and services using locally printed credits, demonstrated this with extraordinary clarity. Participants who brought production skills, food preservation, fermentation, seed cultivation, extracted more value from the network than those who brought credentials. A woman who could teach others to make and preserve food commanded exchange value in the truc that no professional credential could match. The knowledge was the currency, in the most literal possible sense. Now consider what this means for the current moment. As of 2024, 75% of global food calories come from only 12 plants and 5 animals. The supply chains that deliver those calories to urban populations pass through dozens of countries, hundreds of companies, thousands of logistics nodes. The 2020 to 2021 supply chain disruptions demonstrated how quickly those chains can fracture. Grocery shelves emptying in the wealthiest cities on Earth within days of a disruption that was, by historical standards, relatively minor. The knowledge of how to produce, preserve, and distribute food locally is quietly becoming the most undervalued form of human capital on Earth. And in a collapsing economy, undervalued human capital that addresses fundamental needs is precisely the capital that creates the greatest wealth. The specific skills that carry the highest exchange value are not complex. Fermentation and food preservation, seed saving, cold storage, small-scale animal husbandry, and critically, the ability to teach these skills to others. Because in a barter economy, the teacher of a valuable skill commands a premium that the practitioner alone cannot reach. You're not just feeding your family. You're holding the knowledge that feeds the neighborhood. Here is one that never appears on the conventional lists. The one that economic forensics identify consistently, but that almost nobody is deliberately building. The skill of constructing and maintaining trust networks that function outside institutional systems. Let me explain exactly what this means and why it creates wealth during a collapse. In a functioning economy, institutions substitute for personal trust. When you want to buy something from a stranger, you use a bank to hold the transaction. You use a legal system to enforce the contract. You use a regulatory framework to verify quality. The institution mediates trust between parties who don't know each other. In a collapsing economy, those institutions fail. Banks freeze, courts become inaccessible, regulatory systems break down, And suddenly, the ability to transact with people you don't know, which is the foundation of economic complexity, becomes nearly impossible, except for the people who have built dense, high-trust personal networks. For them, the collapse doesn't destroy the ability to transact. It just shifts the basis of transaction from institutional trust to personal trust. And because institutional trust has collapsed for everyone else, personal trust becomes extraordinarily valuable. Look at what happened in post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s. The formal legal system was dysfunctional. Contracts were unenforceable. Property rights were unclear. The people who built the most successful businesses during that decade were not necessarily the most skilled or the most capitalized. They were the people who had the most extensive and trusted personal networks. The people who could connect a buyer and a seller with the personal guarantee that the transaction would be honored, because both parties trusted the connector personally. This is what Russian business culture of the 1990s called BLAT, informal network capital. The ability to get things done through personal connections when formal systems couldn't. And the people who had the densest and most reliable BLAT networks accumulated wealth at a pace that the formally credentialed could not match. The same mechanism appeared in Venezuela post-2015. As the formal economy collapsed, the informal economy that replaced it ran almost entirely on personal trust networks. Access to dollar-denominated transactions, access to goods outside the official price-controlled system, access to employment in the shadow economy. All of it flowed through networks of personal trust. The people who had spent years building those networks, who were known as reliable, as honest, as connected across different communities, found themselves as essential connectors in an economy that had no other connective tissue. They were not just getting by, they were building capital. The specific mechanics of this skill that the forensic data identifies as most valuable are three. The ability to connect people who need things with people who have them, without taking on inventory risk yourself. The ability to verify the reliability of a counterparty to someone who doesn't know them personally. And the ability to structure informal agreements that both parties will honor because the reputational cost of breaking them is too high. These are ancient skills. They are the skills of the medieval merchant, the market connector, the trusted intermediary. They disappeared in modern economies because institutions made them redundant. They return in full force the moment institutions fail. In 2026, the relevant version of this skill is being built right now by the people who are deliberately constructing local economic networks before they need them. Community exchange systems, local supplier relationships, mutual aid structures. These are not survivalist hobby projects. They are the infrastructure of economic resilience. And the people who have built them before the crisis are the ones who hold the connective tissue of the post-crisis economy. Havana, Cuba, 1994. The special period is entering its second year. The formal economy is frozen. The institutional system that once organized Cuban life has effectively ceased to function in any meaningful economic sense. In this environment, one of the highest value economic activities in the country is not production. It is not repair. It is not currency exchange. It is teaching. Specifically, teaching practical skills to people who desperately need them and have no institutional alternative for acquiring them, because the institutions that once taught those skills had all stopped functioning effectively. The doctor, who had retired from formal medicine and began teaching community health workshops, found that her knowledge had extraordinary value. Not because she was practicing medicine in the formal sense, but because she could transfer knowledge that others couldn't acquire anywhere else. The mechanic who spent his evenings teaching 6 neighbors how to maintain and repair their vehicles wasn't just providing a service. He was building a network of reciprocal obligation that would pay dividends for years. Every person he taught became both a future referral source and a person who owed him something. The farmer who understood traditional preservation techniques and began teaching them to urban families found that the teaching itself was more valuable than the produce. This is the compounding mechanism of skill-based wealth in a collapse economy. The skill practitioner earns once. The skill teacher earns from every student. And in an economy where the formal education and training systems have failed, the person who can credibly transfer a practical skill to others has essentially created a private institution, with themselves as the sole faculty. The economic forensics on this are consistent across collapse environments. In the Argentine Truc, courses and workshops were among the highest value items in the exchange network. In post-Soviet Russia, technical training commanded premium exchange value. In Zimbabwe during the hyperinflation, people who could teach others how to navigate the parallel currency economy were extraordinarily well compensated. The mechanism behind this is simple and powerful. Most skills have a one-to-one relationship with value creation. You fix one thing, you earn one payment. You perform one service, you receive one compensation. But the skill of teaching creates a one-to-many relationship. You teach 10 people. Each of them can now perform the skill. Each of them becomes a node in a network that references back to you. And in a collapsing economy, Where institutional education has failed and people are desperately trying to acquire practical skills they never needed before, the demand for this one-to-many value creation is essentially unlimited. The teacher in a collapsed economy is not the wealthiest person, but they are often the most indispensable one. And in economies where indispensability is the currency, indispensable tends to become wealthy. Now look at these 5 skills together and you will see what they have in common. It is not that they are practical rather than intellectual. It is something more precise than that. Each of these skills generates value by addressing a fundamental human need directly, without requiring institutional intermediation. And in a collapse, it is precisely the institutional intermediation that fails first. The repair skill addresses the need to keep essential things functioning. No bureaucracy required, no supply chain required. The thing is either fixed or it isn't. The monetary translation skill addresses the need to exchange value with other humans. No bank required, no clearinghouse required. The transaction either clears or it doesn't. The food production skill addresses the need to eat. No supermarket required, no import system required. The food either grows or it doesn't. The network architecture skill addresses the need to trust the people you transact with. No legal system required, no formal contract required. The trust either exists or it doesn't. The teaching skill addresses the need to acquire knowledge that helps you survive. No school required, no certificate required. The knowledge either transfers or it doesn't. Every one of these skills is what Tim Harford in ADAPT calls modular. They can decouple from the larger system and continue functioning independently when the larger system fails. They are not derivatives. They are the underlying assets. Your professional credential is a derivative. Its value is derived entirely from the institutional system that conferred it. Harvard cannot give you an MBA that functions when Harvard's institutional context doesn't exist. The Bar Association cannot give you a law license that means anything when courts are closed. These credentials are claims on a system. And claims on a failing system are the first thing to become worthless. A skill that addresses a fundamental human need is not a claim on a system. It is the system. Here's the distinction that most analysis of collapse economics misses. And it is the distinction that separates the people who merely survived these collapses from the people who built wealth during them. Survival and wealth creation in a collapsing economy are not the same thing. Survival means maintaining what you have. Wealth creation means acquiring more than you started with. The people who survived but didn't create wealth were the ones who had defensive assets: gold, stored food, cash, and hard currency. These protected them. They emerged from the crisis intact, but they didn't emerge richer. The people who created wealth were the ones who had skills that generated more value the worse things got. The Argentine mechanic, who tripled his income as the collapse deepened. The Lebanese Saraf operator, whose exchange volume exploded as the pound collapsed. The Russian Dacha farmer, whose food production network became the economic hub of his community. These people didn't just weather the storm, they harvested it. And the mechanism through which they harvested it was always the same. They held a skill that addressed a fundamental need directly. They held it before the crisis, so they weren't learning it under pressure. And as the institutional alternatives for meeting that need collapsed around them, the value of their direct capability compounded. This is the core insight that 800 years of economic collapse forensics reveals. The most resilient portfolio of human capital is not the one that maximizes income in stable conditions. It is the one that retains and compounds exchange value across the widest range of systemic conditions. You came into this video thinking about which skills are recession-proof. The recession-proof frame is the wrong frame. Recession-proof means your skill holds its value when things get slightly worse. That is the minimum bar. That is just not losing. The frame that creates wealth is collapse compounding. Which skills not only survive systemic failure, but generate more value as the failure deepens? The answer has been the same for 2,000 years, demonstrated by Weimar mechanics and Argentine refrigeration technicians and Lebanese currency brokers and Cuban community teachers and Venezuelan informal network architects. Skills that address fundamental human needs directly, without institutional intermediation, don't just survive a collapse. They compound through it. The worse things get, the more essential they become. The more essential they become, the more they command. In a world where global debt is approaching $315 trillion, where institutional fragility is at levels the Bank for International Settlements has flagged as comparable to the years before 2008, where artificial intelligence is simultaneously eliminating the credential-dependent knowledge jobs that were supposed to be the safe floor. The question is not whether to build these skills. The question is which ones you build first, and whether you build them before you need them. Because the mechanic who was already fixing refrigerators when Buenos Aires collapsed in 2001 wasn't lucky. He was positioned. And positioning, as every economic autopsy and recorded history confirms, is a decision made long before the crisis arrives. Not during it, before it. The people who got rich in every collapse you have ever studied didn't react to the crash. They were already holding what the crash made valuable. Every economic collapse in modern history has not been purely a disaster. It has been a redistribution event, a transfer of economic power from those holding institutional dependencies to those holding direct capabilities. The middle class was taught that education and credentials are the path to economic security. The forensic record of every collapse says something different. It says that credentials are claims on a system, and systems fail. Skills that address fundamental human needs are not claims on a system. They were there before the institutions existed. They will be there after the institutions are gone. You did not come to this video because everything feels stable. You came because something in the current picture doesn't add up. Because the explanations you're being given don't quite match the reality you are living. That instinct is correct. The warning signs that preceded every collapse we examined are not hidden. They are visible in the debt numbers, in the institutional fragility data, in the behavioral patterns of the people who have studied this for their entire professional lives. Are you building what the next phase makes valuable? Or are you still holding what the current phase made comfortable? History doesn't grade on preparation. It only records outcomes. Subscribe to the Wealth Files. We perform economic autopsies here so you don't become the next case study.